Welcome back for another session of practice multiple choice questions. Today we are going to be looking at our political systems midterm. So we're going to be looking at the questions, working through them, and then looking at the results that we had as a class and seeing potentially where you may have made some mistakes. So here we go. Use the following source for questions 1 and 2. Again, I look at the source, there's a lot going on there. I'm going to skip the source for now, and I'm going to take a peek at the questions. Which of the following academic inquiries, academic inquiries, could be best investigated by examining the above arguments? So which of the following could be best investigated by examining the above? So one of these 4 things could be investigated by looking at these 4 things. So again, it's a matching thing for us to work on. It's like we are studying one of these 4 topics and we want to see which one fits in with these 4 things. So it's good to distinguish between our options. Evolution of non-liberalism to liberalism. So going from like a dictatorship, from authoritarianism to democracy. So I might write that in pen next to it if I had a print copy of this. Evolution of non-liberalism to liberalism. So I should try to anticipate what would that look like. That would look like talking about how, say, the Soviet Union went from under the one-party state in the 1980s to a democracy when it becomes Russia. That's an evolution of non-liberalism to liberalism, or even the monarchy of the old regime of France. That was non-liberalism, it was monarchy to liberalism. So I can go back now and look to see if I'm getting that kind of information here. To be a person is to connect with others by acting in a relationship with them. Participation in ceremonial rituals helps only to cultivate the ethically appropriate emotional attitudes towards others as they instantate certain roles. Well, I don't see anything about authoritarianism there. In Western nations and at an extreme in America, many people have a greater tendency to see themselves as beings with internal characteristics and traits that can be specified independently of their social roles and relationships. Okay, I'm not seeing anything about authoritarianism there. To deprive man of freedom is to relegate him to the status of a thing. Okay. So I'm going to have to look and see what B is. Conflict between individual and collective identities. Let's go back to 2. In Western nations and at an extreme in America, many people have a greater tendency to see themselves as beings with internal characteristics and traits that can be specified independently of their social roles. 2 definitely seems to fit in with B, conflict between internal and collective identities. To deprive man of freedom is to relegate him to the status of a thing. Man must never be trusted as a means to the state, but always with an end within himself, a personal, an individual identity rather than being defined by the state. To be a person is to connect with others. So our identity is with how we connect with others in 1. Participation in ceremonial rituals, connecting with others, collective identity in 1. We cannot ignore the plight of others. Our job is to be connected with others. So I'm seeing a big pull to B. We did have some answers, it appears. We had some students that went with D on this one. So most did get the B, but those that ended up getting D on it, sustainability of an ideological plurality in a homogenized world. Can we sustain more than one ideology in a world where people are becoming homogenized? So maybe should we sustain it? Should we? Should we sustain it could fit into these. should we sustain plurality? Should we have multiplicity? It's not necessarily even just talking about differences between you and I. It's that you and I, instead of just being different, we define ourselves internally, right? See themselves as internal characteristics. It doesn't really say that your internal characteristics are different than my internal characteristics. It's not necessarily talking about plurality or multiplicity. It's just talking about individualism. So here, when it's talking about ceremonial rituals to cultivate the ethically appropriate emotional attitudes, it's not necessarily talking about homogenization. Homogenization and plurality could fit, but it's not as clear of a fit with some of the language being used here. But I could see the pull to D. And it has to be somewhat attractive, otherwise the question becomes too easy. Number 2, the most likely consequence of action taken by someone adopting the last perspective. So last perspective, we cannot ignore the plight of others. So somebody helping others. Whenever and wherever the character of one person is attacked, we are all attacked. Nobody's free until we are all free. Change must begin in the little places closest to home. The most likely consequence of action taken. So what is the action up here? We cannot ignore others. Change must happen closest to home. So we need to create change close to home to help others in plight. Most likely consequence of actions taken by someone adopting the last perspective shown would be volunteer at a local soup kitchen. By volunteering at a soup kitchen, are you helping those who cannot help themselves? Are you responding to the plight of others? Yeah, I think you are. When you volunteer at a local soup kitchen, are you, as the quote was saying, change must begin in little places? Is a soup kitchen a little place close to home? Well, it says at a local soup kitchen. The term local means it's close to home. So the volunteering at a local soup kitchen fulfills this criteria. Change must begin at the little places closest to home. And it fulfills this criteria. We cannot ignore the plight of others. It definitely fits. Nobody's free until we are all free. Interesting. Very interesting. It looks like the other poll that you guys had there for number 2 was to D and even to C, that more people didn't get the right answer than got the right answer. So let's look at D and C for a second. Let's just close that. We don't need that open. D and C, trust in government to provide the change we need. So the most likely consequence of action taken by someone adopting. To trust in government means I'm not going to do something. I'm going to believe someone else is going to do it. I'll put my faith in government to do it. But here it's a call to action. We cannot ignore the plight. Nobody's free. Change must begin in the little places closest to home. There's more of a responsibility inferred upon the citizen than there is the faith that the state at large is going to provide that. And then the other one that people had picked was C. Impose liberalism on failed and flawed nations. Definitely there's this idea of helping others around the world. We cannot ignore the plight of others, but imposing liberalism has a negative connotation. And imposing liberalism globally ignores that part. Because it ignores this part, and because the other one has this part and this part in it, that's why A is your better answer. Okay, so for the next one, we have a long quote by former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. And therefore, I'm going to be lazy. I'm going to say, let's take a look at the question. Taken in context, which of the following quotes would be used best today to formulate a counter-argument against the contemporary growth of populism? So again, we have to know our terms in order to even begin this question. If you don't know what populism is, then you are stuck. Now, on a day like this, where it's not a closed exam anymore, then we can just simply look it up and remind ourselves, right? But I'm sure nobody did that at home when you had this as a take-home exam. So, a political approach that strives to appeal to ordinary citizens, ordinary people who feel that their concerns are disregarded by the elite. Let's do what the people, the plebeians, the masses, the 99% need us to do. So, taken in context, which of the following quotes would be used today to formulate a counter-argument against the contemporary growth of populism? Looks like the majority of you got this one right. But let's say, how did you get it right? Uniformity is neither desirable nor possible in a country the size of Canada that have a connection with populism. The word uniformity is throwing me off there. I don't know. There are a counter-argument against populism. Counter-argument against populism. That's the key. There are few policies potentially more disastrous for Canada than to tell all Canadians that they must be alike. I don't see a connection there yet. There's no such thing as a model for ideal Canadian. So B and C are very similar. A great society which emphasizes uniformity is one which creates intolerance and hate. So, if you link uniformity to populism, then the counter-argument in D would be that with populism, with uniformity, comes intolerance and hate. That what's the argument against popularism? It leads to intolerance and hate. Is popularism connected to uniformity? Well, in America, populism includes xenophobia, includes shutting its borders down, trying to protect the social fabric, the ethnic fabric of America as it is. Therefore, it is uniformity. So, in an American populist sense, D is your answer. Now, why is it not B? Because many people pick B. Many people. Well, not many, but some people pick B, right? So we had 3 Bs and 2 Cs. So why is it not B? Why is it not B? There are few policies potentially more disastrous for Canada than to tell all Canadians they must be alike. Yeah, so that's similar to D. I can see the similarity there. There are a few policies potentially more disastrous for Canada than to tell all Canadians they must be alike. Must be alike. The D and B are very similar, but the thing that makes D better is that D specifically gets to the intolerance and hate that would be the consequences of populism, which would be your counter argument. B is more general, just saying, well, populism, if you're still linking it with uniformity that B is speaking to, will create, disaster for Canada, but it's not specific. So it could be used best today to formulate a counter argument. The best counter argument there would be the one that is more specific. The counter argument in B is that it's a disaster for Canada. The counter argument for D is that it will create intolerance and hate. Intolerance and hate is a PF argument. It's more specific, it's more sound, whereas it'll lead to disaster for Canada is more generalized. How will it lead to disaster? What is that disaster a consequence of? The disaster will be a consequence of intolerance and hate, and that's why D is a better answer. But I can see the poll to B for sure, but D is just a little, one more nuance, more clear. We're both saying the same thing. D is just saying it more clear, and because it's saying used best today, that's why the answer is that. These are tough questions. Number 4. Use the following sources for the question 4. The primary message communicated by presenting the 2 photographs together. 1922, 2017. So we've seen these in our lessons. Often the executive branch enforces laws that violate their general will. Is it the general will that's being violated? I mean, are the people upset about what's happening in either photo? Are the agents of the executive branch in either photo doing something that the masses on the beaches are protesting? They seem fairly maybe not satisfied, but they're accepting what's happening, except for the lady that's being told to not wear a burkini in the second one, but everybody around her seemed to be okay with the police presence. Where state laws and cultural laws do not align, people must follow their culture. Okay, must follow their culture. I don't see a big cultural thing in the first one. There's a cultural connection to the second one. And I'm not sure the message is that the woman should keep wearing her burkini. Maybe it's a pro collective identity message, but let's keep looking. As liberalism evolves, society continues to redefine what is acceptable. So liberalism's changing here. These women are a little bit more liberal than the government. So the government is still trying to determine whether or not their outfits are acceptable. Liberalism has evolved here. With it, socially, you have plurality and multiplicity. You have, in the global village, you have a flow of people from one group to another. And because of that, you have a clash of cultural values. And they're trying to figure out what's acceptable. Yeah, that seems to be what's happening here. Conservative and liberal values and norms cannot coexist with any liberal society. Conservative and liberal values cannot coexist. Conservative values, liberal values, conflict. Conservative values, liberal values, conflict. So definitely there's a pull to D, which I'm kind of surprised that not more people went with D. Your second best answer, it appears to be, was A. You guys found this one fairly easy, actually. But it is talking about, as liberalism evolves, society continues to redefine what is acceptable. This outfit may be acceptable. He needs to measure it. A generation before, they wouldn't have been questioning that. A generation later, that this might be seen as very modest, right? Generation before, women might have been wearing a lot more, and there wouldn't have been, people trying to push for something a little more revealing at the beach. Definitely. Number 5, use the following visual for question 5. Both positions, position 1, position 2, are possible answers to the inquiry of, comma, to what extent something, something, something. So let's take a look at the two positions. Awareness of the cycle of class warfare will lead to a worker revolution and the establishment of a new society of egalitarianism. So the one on the left is Marxism. It is our destiny to feed on the weaker nations of the world as we assume rightful position as masters of Europe. The one on the right is a reactionary, fascist, probably national socialist coming from Nazi Germany perspective. So I get it. We have communism and fascism. So both positions, communism and fascism, may provide answers to the inquiry of to what extent something. So let's go back to the language. Awareness of the cycle of class warfare will lead to a worker revolution and the establishment of a new society of egalitarianism. It is our destiny to feed on. So the answer is in the language here. Totalitarian movements get their power from the claim to be expressions of inevitable forces. So looking at A, awareness of the cycle of class warfare. So there's this conflict that's happening, and we're going to become aware of it, will lead to a worker revolution. That our ism, Marxism, is an expression of an inevitable force of nature or history. It's an inevitable force of history because history is a history of class struggle, and out of that comes the epiphany. It's inevitable, an epiphany where the workers realize they're being exploited, and therefore their movement gets their power from this inevitable force. That certainly fits here. It is our destiny to feed on the weaker nations. It is our destiny. It is inevitable. As we assume our rightful position, it's our rightful position. It's inevitable. So definitely a pull to A. It looks like most of you got this one as well, but those of you that didn't kind of went all over the place here. So let's look at the other places. D, the ideal subject of a totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction no longer exists. So this could be the answer. If I'm only looking at this and saying, you know what, there's no fact saying that it's just a narrative being spun by the state that you will be the masters of Europe. There's no fact here that Germans should be the masters, but you can definitely look at facts showing that there was a conflict between the factory workers and the capitalists. That there's data, that there's observable details, that you can look at, wages, you can look at the suffering in the slums, you can look at, the oppression, the creation of legislation or the maintenance of government that was meant to continue the cycle of abuse from the bourgeoisie over the proletariat. So that doesn't fit with that one. But yeah. And then the other one, the one person went with was C. Tyrannies can seem to come out of nowhere with great force, but are equally susceptible to sudden collapse. There's nothing in here about their collapses. Not C. Oh, sorry, the other one was B. Revolutions always claim to be the new beginnings for the people, but the price of destroying the old institutions is instability and vulnerability to despots. Definitely they talk about being a new beginning, but there's nothing in here about despotism creating instability or vulnerability. So, lots of great answers there. Good work for most of you getting the A. Number 6, we can see with 6 that most people do get C, but let's take a peek. Let's take a peek. Oh, it's the cartoon that we talked about a million times. So this was probably easy because we talked about it a million times, and then you're like, oh, we talked about this one. The primary message is what is defined as objectionable will evolve, and therefore we should use caution before we whitewash history. Literally said that sentence when we talked about it. So good work with that. Number 7, let's not look at the answer before we do this one this time. Here's the long quote from Hobbes. Hey, we know this quote. We've seen this quote. We've been taught this quote. We've seen it on an A1 perhaps that we worked on if we did our A1. Which of the following examples of modern Leviathan would be least objectionable to a supporter of liberalism? So which of these following scenarios would somebody who likes democracy say, you know what, I kind of get that? Or somebody who likes individualism say, you know what, this is least objectionable. So I don't like any of these 4 things, right? They're all objectionable. But this is the least objectionable, meaning I'm getting something. I'm still not getting what I want. I'm not getting democracy, but I'm a supporter of individualism. I'm a supporter of liberalism. I'm getting something from it. A monster that spreads its tentacles into all parts of society. That is objectionable because it's a monster, right? So I'm picturing Glichelton under the Nazis. I'm picturing Big Brother 1984. It's a monster. It's not much of somebody who's an individualist, a liberal would say, well, at least we're getting this. A benevolent, even the word benevolent is beginning to say, this is your answer, buddy. A benevolent dictator, so a good dictator who supports the arts, education, and healthcare. So a supporter of liberalism might say, okay, we have a Leviathan, but at least we have healthcare. We have a dictator, and we don't want that, but at least everybody can read. Our life expectancy is longer. And look, we even have the arts. We have music, and we have theater, and we have painting and sculpture and the other forms of art, comic books, that's an American art form, right? So a benevolent dictator who supports the arts. And arts is an expression of individuality. Education can lead to people unlocking other ideas through through literacy and healthcare. Even if you have indoctrination here, even if this is used for propaganda and indoctrination, healthcare is still letting people live longer. So B is your answer. And most people got it. Bravo. Tip of the hat. Tip of the hat. Tip of the hat. So some others said A or D. A monster. A bloated one-party state that inefficiently provides for some people while ignoring most. Unless you're those some, unless you're the some, then there's not a lot of pull to say, I would like to live under D. Which one of these four scenarios would be the best to live under if you value freedom? It's not D, unless you happen to be one of these very few people. So for number 8, we have a quote by Nietzsche, and it says, having the right enemy can be a powerful motivating force, straight out of our Techniques of Dictatorship lesson. Which of the following scenarios provides an example of this theory in practice that both liberals and authoritarians would support? Cuban leader Fidel Castro recognized illiteracy as a barrier to success and therefore mobilized the nation towards literacy. Okay, wait. So we need, which of the following scenarios provides an example? Having the right enemy. So our enemy is illiteracy. We motivate people to get literacy. Is literacy something that both liberals and authoritarians would support? Yeah. I don't think I should put the answer as A. That makes it too obvious. So it's got to be A. And it looks like the majority of you saw that. But we had some people go with B and D, so let's take a peek at those. Prime Minister Trudeau has used international summits of world leaders to question the Saudi government's human rights record. Well, that's great to do that. But I'm not. See, the first one, you have a problem, illiteracy, that is motivating. It's the solution to literacy is distracting, right, the country of Cuba, mobilizing the country, and because the country is mobilized, moving in that direction, it's an enemy that the entire country can work towards defeating together, and it creates unity within that country, and it creates some kind of scapegoat, an escape. Now, if for B, if Trudeau somehow included the Canadian people on this, and we became mobilized against the Saudis, then that might be the answer. But because Trudeau, yes, the Saudis are the right enemy for Canada because of their human rights record. I don't see it as a powerful motivating force for all Canadians. It's motivating Trudeau, at least it motivated him until he got distracted by something else. We also had some people go to D. German leader Adolf Hitler used public discontent with the outcome of World War I, redirected it to the Jewish people. This is a classic example of scapegoating, but the question says, an example of this theory in practice that both liberals and authoritarians would support. Liberals wouldn't support the genocide of the Jewish people. And B, authoritarians wouldn't support questioning human rights record. So B, dictators wouldn't be okay with Trudeau, and D, liberal people wouldn't be okay with Hitler. But A, both dictators and liberals would be okay with Castro. So Castro for the win. Castro for the win. I like how I put Castro and Trudeau in the same question. Number 9. The best term to place where the X is would be cruelty, Ideology, injustice, or state power? Something. So is it cruelty? Gives evil doing its long sought justification and gives the evildoer the necessary steadfastness and determination. I'm doing this because I'm cruel. And the 20th century was fated to experience evil doing on a scale calculated in the millions because people are like, you know what? I can do this because of cruelty. Cruelty makes it acceptable. So they're being cruel for sure, but is cruelty the justifiable excuse? No. Ideology. So the 20th century was fated to experience evil doing because of communism and fascism. They're both ideologies. Ideology gives evildoers its long sought justification. I can do this because of communism. I can do this because of fascism. Seems to fit. So let's look at the answers. So when we look at the answers, we can see that 4 people got it, but more people actually chose C and D than they chose B. So let's go back to C and D. Injustice. Injustice gives evildoer its long sought justification. So I'm doing this because of injustice. I'm doing this to combat injustice, maybe. You know, we have to liquidate the kulaks to combat injustice. Injustice is a part of their ideology, though, and it's more than just injustice. That the Nazis, certainly Hitler would say that they've been guilty, that injustice have been served to Germany, right, in the Weimar Republic. But what gives them the right to go and take Poland and to expand? What gives them the right to Lebensraum? It's the ideology that social Darwinism within fascism, that the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. That idea of the strong feeding on the weak. And that's ideology, not injustice. Did they felt that injustice had been served to the Weimar Republic? Of course they did. Now the Soviets, there had been past injustice against the workers, but it was really ultimately ideology that that justified the collectivization of the land of the kulaks, the evildoing. It's really ideology that allows the Führer to commit a purge during the night of long knives, or sorry, during the night of long knives. It's not injustice that the SS have been up to, or the SA, sorry, have been up to. It was ideology that said, you know what, I am the Führer. I am not to be questioned, and potentially the leader of the SA could question me and pose a threat. So ideologically, I am going to cleanse. So injustice has a pull because you know, most revolutionaries will say that, you know, they've been victimized, right? We've been victims, and we're fighting back, and you know, this is how we achieve justice. But ultimately, in the 20th century, that at the heart of what it was there was this new ideology that gave them some kind of ends that justified the means. So in a Machiavellian way, what Stalin was doing was justified through ideology. That we were going to create a utopia. We were going to create a workers' paradise where the state could wither away. That in Hitler's ideology, they were going to create a Reich that would last 1,000 years. And certainly there was a component of injustice that had plagued them in history, but ultimately what gave them the right to do what they were doing in the 20th century, the evil doing, wasn't to overcome injustice, it was to implement ideology. So these are great questions. Whew, these are good questions. They're hard questions. These are hard questions. Number 10. Which of the following statements is most directly supported by the information presented? So back to the old matching game. It looks like the majority of you ended up getting it right. So 9 people pick C, but we did have some people pick A and D and B. So you know what? This is a good question because every answer had at least some pull to it. So the question was able to basically do its purpose, which was to allow people to really discriminate on how much knowledge you had about this question. So let's look at number 10. Which of the following statements is most directly supported by the information presented? So, what do we have presented? The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power in our country. Huh. Wow. So here we have a quote that is suggesting that democracy is a facade and that like the media is running the hearts and minds of people. Propaganda is a neutral tool that can be used for good or ill, but in order to have power in modern society, one must know its techniques. Propaganda is an instrument that can fight for productive ends and bring order out of chaos. Okay, so pro-propaganda, a warning about the power of the media. Which of the following statements is most directly supported by the information presented? Non-liberal states are more efficient as they alone can control the hearts and minds of the citizens. So they're using language like hearts and minds that I use in class all the time. So you're like, dude, he says hearts and minds in class. That's got to be the answer. No, it's not that easy all the time. Non-liberal states are more efficient. Is this one saying that they're more efficient? This one's talking about efficiency of propaganda, that we must know it, that it's useful, it's a tool, it's a weapon. Is this one saying it's efficient? It's an important element. I don't know, maybe. Let's keep reading. Techniques of dictators are only effective in regimes where the people are allotted minimal individual freedoms. Well, no, we're suggesting both of these are suggesting that propaganda can be used in a liberal democracy. Here it is being used in a liberal democracy where, at least on the surface, people do have full individual freedoms. So B is not a viable answer. In order to be both viable and moral, a state must use illiberal techniques to overcome the limiting ignorance of the masses. Whew, there's a lot happening in that one. In order to become viable and moral, the state must use illiberal techniques to overcome the limiting ignorance of the masses. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in a democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government that is the true ruling power. So is this anti-propaganda? It's an important element. If it's speaking against propaganda, it wouldn't be saying it's important. It would say it's a dangerous element or hidden or toxic, but it's an important element. The conscious and intelligent manipulation. We have to manipulate the masses. Why do we have to manipulate the masses? Is it because they're ignorant? Propaganda is a neutral tool that can be used for good or evil, but in order to have power in modern society, one must know its techniques. Propaganda is an instrument that can fight for productive ends and bring order out of chaos. Order out of chaos. In order to be both viable and moral, a state must use. What's the morality part of it? Propaganda can be used for good or ill. It can use it for morals. Morals being good. Can bring you out of chaos. If you're in chaos, it's not viable. It can overcome the lack of viability. Conscious and intelligent manipulation of organized habits and opinions is an important element. Those who manipulate. Yeah, so I'm seeing the idea of propaganda is an effective that can fight for productive ends, bring it out of chaos. That's a connection to viability. It's important to overcome the opinions of the masses. That's speaking to the idea of ignorance of the masses, the moral part. It can be used for good. That's the connections I have for C. I believe the test got a little easier now, and I guess I'm wrong. So for number 11, you guys did not like the answer. Whew, only 4 people liked it, and a lot more people liked B. Hopefully the answer is not B, because then I'm going to look like a fool here. It could be, and then I'll have to go back and change the key, and then your answers will look much better. But let's take a look. Number 11. Source 1 highlights. Okay, so we have a whole list of techniques of dictatorship. We have Nazis and communists. We have Hitler and Stalin. I would have drawn them the other way. I would have had, Stalin on the left and Hitler on the right. But that's just me. Little details. Source 1 highlights the similarities in the techniques used by both fascist and communist leaders in ideological theory, what they would have, agreed or disagreed. So I don't even have to really read this. It's just like, do I know the ideological theory behind communism and fascism? Agreed as both recognize imperialism as a dangerous, barbarous pursuit. Fascists are pro-imperialism, a strong feed upon the weak. Lebensraum is imperialism. So if you pick A, you don't understand that fascists use imperialism to grow. That's a whole part of social Darwinism. So what number are we on? 11. Only 2 people picked A. So that's good. Agreed as both wanted to replace liberalism with classless authoritarianism. The goal of communism is classlessness. The goal of fascism is for meritocracy and to highlight some at the expense of others. There were still classes in Schindler's Germany, right? Schindler was wealthy. He owned a factory, but there were other Germans who were not wealthy. That fascism's not about overcoming class division. It's about magnifying that. So it can't be B. So those of you that picked B, and the majority of you did, you need to go back to your theory about fascism. Fascism is not overcoming inequality. Fascism is highlighting and exaggerating that inequality and promoting some at the expense of others. There's great inequality in Hitler's Germany, to the point that some are simply seen as inhuman. Disagreed as fascists want to exaggerate inequality in their pursuit of racial purity. Absolutely. The main focus from source 2 shows which technique from source 1. So here we have a voting thing going on. Let the people decide. Hitler's saying let them decide. There's an election, but at the election, it doesn't look like Elections Canada. He has his forces there to intimidate people at the polling booth. So we have controlled participation. What are our answers? 4, 6, 8, and 10. 4. Find an enemy scapegoat to blame. Maybe using propaganda, indoctrination, force, and terror. Maybe there's force and terror there. Holding elections in which it is impossible for people to vote for anyone else. There it is. Because it's an election. And number 11, or number 12. Oh, everybody got that one right. Everybody got that one right. It was too easy. 13. 13 people do well on. Supporters of MLK Jr., Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s opinion shared in 1 would respond to the others by, well, what's his opinion in 1? To deprive man of freedom is to regulate him to the status of a thing, rather than elevate him to the status of a person. Man must never be trusted as a means to the end of the state, but always as an end within himself. Okay? So his quote is, pro-individualism, right? And the other ones I can see are dictators. So how would supporters of individualism respond to the dictators? Proclaiming state control of education as a weapon that limits our lives. Rejecting the idea that indoctrination is an effective tool. Challenging the selfish and divisive desires that individuals are prone to have. Accepting the need for the state to create unity. Well, are there any that you can rule out? Well, they're not going to accept the need for the state to take over the curriculum. and create unity of purpose. So we're going to get rid of that. We're going to get rid of D. Now it looks like the majority of you did as well. Looks like the majority of you had it down to A and B. So what's the difference? Rejecting the idea that indoctrination is an effective tool? Are they rejecting that it's effective? Or they would respond by promoting state control of education as a weapon that limits our lives. They're not saying it's not effective. It's not that whether or not it is an effective tool. It's whether or not it's a tool that should be used. So I might be, anti guns, and I'm not saying that guns are not effective. Guns are really effective. I'm saying guns are not appropriate. So A is saying it's not appropriate. B is saying that it's not effective. And MLK is not saying it's not effective. To deprive man of freedom is to relegate him to the status of a thing. So he's saying it's effective. You've taken his freedom and made him into a thing. That's an effect. There has been an effect on someone, right? So he's not saying it's not effective. It's very effective. But he's saying that no. What it's doing is it's a weapon that limits our lives because now you're just a thing. And a thing is more limited than a human. If the classroom from 2 was from the United States of 51, the federal government, so this is a classroom from 51 in the US, then I got to say in my mind, okay, US 51 contextually, what's happening? McCarthyism, right? So McCarthyism, federal government, they're encouraging the teacher. So she's actually an instrument, a tool of McCarthyism, saying to the children, watch your parents, obey the state. So they would reject the cartoonist promotion of illiberal tactics. Well, the cartoonist isn't promoting it. And in fact, the federal government wouldn't reject illiberalism, they'd be supporting it because they're the ones, wanting to have this witch hunt. Support the teacher's message due to the perceived threat. So because of the perceived threat of communist insurgents, they're asking their students to watch their parents. Yes. Reject the cartoonist perspective as the cartoonist shouldn't question official state policy. There still is some dissent in America. And yes, you're right. People that voted their discontent with the state policy would be subject to criticism. But it's more likely that they'd be happy with what the teacher's doing. Support the teacher's instructions as it reflects America's schools during segregation. This isn't an issue of segregation. This is an issue of fighting against communism. But good catch with segregation being the year. So a good poll to that too. Man, that makes it a good question. So 14. Some of you did jump to A and C. Man, one person jumped to the segregation thing, so I got to make that one better. But let's look at why you jumped to A. Reject the cartoonist promotion of illiberal tactics. He's not promoting them. The cartoonist isn't saying this is the right thing to do. The state is supreme. This isn't an ad for obedience of kids, because there's something about looking into this cartoon that makes us uncomfortable. So that's why we know that the cartoonist, uncomfortable with the state policy, uncomfortable with the teacher's teachings here, and desire for obedience, is questioning it through this cartoon. So it's not that the cartoonist is promoting, it's the cartoonist is rejecting that. So one of the things that you may be having difficulty with in these sources is understanding the purpose of the source, the ideological perspective, the agenda. So if you are finishing your test, and you're finishing your test within an hour or an hour and a half, and you have a 3-hour window or a 4-hour window, slow down. Just slow down a little bit, and then really break each question down. The conditions, concerns, and values highlighted in the above source have been used to justify. This is straight matching recall. So if you get this one wrong, you need to study more. Promotes class distinctions. Sees that democracy perpetuates mediocrity. Seeks aggressive military expansion. So this is fascism. So this is A, this is recall, this is fascism. But if you picked A here, then how did you get Where was it? How did you get this one wrong? If you picked A for the later one, because you understand fascists like inequality, then how did you pick this one wrong and go with B? If you pick B for 11 and A for this one, then your attention is drifting during your test because you understand that fascism promotes class distinctions. But up here, you decided it didn't. Up here, you decided that they both wanted classlessness. That doesn't make sense. So during a test, there shouldn't be queuing from one question to another. The answer of one question shouldn't help you with another one. But unfortunately, we can only make so many questions. So sometimes there might be information in one question that can help you with another one and can expose things like this. So I don't know if that applies to anyone on this test, whether you got one right and one wrong, but they both kind of go together. So it'll be interesting to see. Let's go to 15. Our results on 15 were, most people got it right. So 13 out of 16 people got 15 right. And if we go back to number 11, remember, a lot more people got that one wrong. Look at that. Number 11, most people actually said B, which says that fascists want classlessness. If you pick B here, you can't pick A here. If you pick A here, you can't pick B up there. So it's either one or the other. That's alarming that so many people got this one right and so many people got the other one wrong. All right, number 16. Each of the above pieces of legislation shows. So it's a set. We're familiar with that set. Separation of power is not prudent during times of crisis. Maybe. You know, we see a centralization of authority during a crisis so that they can respond to it. Government accountability is secondary to systemic legitimacy. Is the Enabling Act keeping the system legitimate? You know, War Measures Act, Trudeau says, prevent the law of the jungle. He's implementing this. But did the Enabling Act, was the purpose of the Enabling Act to save the Weimar Republic and democracy? I mean, Hitler may have proclaimed that. USA Patriot Act, is that to save American democracy? Anti-Terrorist Act. A bit of a poll then, right? When people fear the future, they will escape future freedom into the illusion of security. Were people afraid in 33, 70, 01, 15, and that's why they're okay with exchanging some liberty for security. The will of the people is a flawed foundation that for a society that values human rights. The Enabling Act isn't to create a Germany of more human rights. D is your worst answer. We're going to rule out D. There's no like, man, Hitler is like, we need this for human rights. So we're going to get rid of that. Separation of power is not prudent during times of crisis. Government accountability is secondary to systemic legitimacy. When people fear the future, they will escape freedom. I'm guessing that we had a pretty even split between A, B's, and C's. 16. C's, B's, and A's. So most people saw C, but we also had some B's and A's. When people fear the future, they'll escape freedom into the illusion of security. And you probably got it right because I did mention that a lot while we're talking about these acts. If you didn't get that, you might have not been present during those hangouts. But there is a pull to the others. Government accountability is secondary to systemic legitimacy. Again, I may argue that the Enabling Act wasn't about saving democracy. That Hitler had already made it clear in his platform and his policies in his book Mein Kampf that he valued authoritarianism. Government accountability secondary to systemic legitimacy, then I would rule out. Separation of power is not prudent during times of crisis. We still have separation of power in the USA Patriot Act time. We still have separation of power in America today. The USA Patriot Act did not get rid of separation of power. It gave the executive branch, enriched powers, but there still was judicial review of the USA Patriot Act. There still was a legislative branch, Congress, that was separate from the executive branch. So I'm going to rule that out. But there was a poll, as there should be. 17. Use the following observations for question 17. We got Lenin's coup, we got Stalin, Article 12, killing 12-year-olds. So yeah, all you communists out in the streets saying that we should have communism. Now, of course, you're going to say, well, Stalin wasn't a real communist. He was a Stalinist, and it wasn't what Marx wanted. Okay. But I do think that there's enough blood in the hands of communism that you guys need a different name. Communism has too much baggage. Too much baggage. Too many people. You know, when you've killed tens of millions of people, maybe the ideology needs to be rebranded. Ideas have consequences. Lenin's coup opened a new stage in human history. Ideas have consequences. And in the middle, we have consequences. Kids are killed. An opponent of communism. So, this guy hates communism. So, people in the West would respond to the information by stating the consequences suffered by these poisonous ideas was the demise of the Soviet Union. Ultimately, the consequences of the ideology, the whole thing, the breakup of the Soviet Union was because of the toxic ideology. Yeah, we could see that. Lenin's revolution led to the world's first nation that replaced oppression with egalitarianism. And a proponent of communism would say that, but not an opponent. So if you pick B, you don't know the word opponent. You can't distinguish of objectives and division of society and ideological perspectives. True communism was never implemented. Now, a proponent of communism would say that, but not an opponent. A proponent, someone who likes communism, would say, hey, this isn't communism. The legal system under Stalin wasn't meant to represent justice, but rather create unity through fear and terror. So, let's go to your answers. What number is this? 17. 17, we have A's, D's, and C's. D was the next best answer. The legal system under Stalin wasn't meant to represent justice, but rather create unity through fear and terror. An opponent of communism would respond to the information from the source by stating that the legal system, right here, wasn't meant to create justice, but rather create unity through fear and terror. Stalin introduced Article 12, which permitted that children aged 12 and older would be sentenced to death. Will that create unity through fear and terror? Or is it likely that because of all these things, the Soviet Union fell? I think it's more likely that because of all of these things, because of Lenin and Stalin's revolution, ultimately there's stagnation, the hearts and minds are lost, Soviet Union collapses. Rather than, hey, look at this, because we can kill kids, we're all together. But you're right that it didn't represent justice. That killing 12-year-olds wasn't always like, oh, it's because they broke a law. It was about showing the power, the absolute authority of Stalin. But the idea about ideas have consequences, right? The consequences is more connected. This part, this third of the source is more connected to A than D. We got Muammar Gaddafi, or Muammar Gaddafi, and President Trump. And we got this quote here. I don't want to read that. To an open-minded yet committed supporter of liberalism, the above account offers frustrating facts that undermine their resolve, evidence as to why authoritarianism is the main threat, accounts that show that the ideology may be flawed and still needs to evolve, unprovable speculation. So here we have Trump saying during the 2016 election, he criticized the Clinton Foundation for accepting money from the Saudis due to their lack of freedom offered to women in Saudi Arabia. Once elected, President Trump sealed a $110 billion arms deal with the same Saudi government, and his daughter secured donations for her nonprofit organization. And Colonel Muammar Gaddafi was often painted by the West as a murderous megalomaniac, earning such hatred that his daughter was killed during an 86 attempted regime change that used U.S. strikes against the family compound. To the black African people, Mr. Gaddafi was a benevolent dictator who gave millions to health, educational, and agricultural things. So this shows an authoritarian doing good stuff. This shows a liberal democratic leader being a hypocrite. To open-minded, so okay, I'm open-minded, yet committed. So I'm not gonna, okay, I'm committed. I'm not gonna say I'm gonna become an authoritarian. I'm committed. I'm a supporter of liberalism. I'm committed, but I'm open-minded. So it's frustrating that undermines the resolve. No, you can't undermine my resolve for freedom. I'm committed. So if you picked A, you don't understand what the yet committed part of the prompt said. You're committed. It's not undermining you. Evidence as to why authoritarianism is the main threat. Showed authoritarianism in a good light. Accounts that show that the ideology may be flawed and still needs to evolve. So I'm committed, but I'm open-minded. I'm open-minded saying, yeah, you know what? Liberalism may need to continue to evolve, but I'm not saying we need to get rid of it. I'm committed to liberalism. I'm open to it evolving. It needs to evolve because we still have corruption. It needs to evolve because we have corruption, but I'm committed to it. I'm not saying that this is evidence that we need to go to authoritarianism. I could see C. Unprovable speculation and propaganda. So can you prove this? Yeah, no. There's a quid pro quo. There's a trace. You could trace the money. So I'm gonna go with C. See how well you guys did. Most of you picked C. Some picked A, some picked B, some picked D. But again, if you picked A, you don't get this part. Yet committed. If you're committed, you're not being undermined. Your resolve is not being undermined if you're committed. So if you got that one wrong because you picked A, you got to slow down and really read the language, the wording. Okay, so this is the last two that we're going to do, and then we'll stop it for the halftime show, and then I'll create a second set or a second video because this video is already like super long, and you know nobody wants to sit through 2 hours of this. So use the following map for question 19 to 20. So here we have most states in the Western Hemisphere are free with some exceptions like communist Venezuela. And then you have a lot of dictatorships in Asia and Africa. Okay. And then we have a pro-anarchy quote from Emma Goldman. And I know that because I studied my cast of characters and I know she's an anarchist. Details within from the source, from the map, illustrates that people turn to extreme ideologies after the fail of liberalism. So do I know that liberalism's failed in these countries and then they went to dictatorships? I don't know that based upon this. So there's nothing in here that tells me what happened before it and why they've gone red or why they've gone green. So it can't be that. In most European nations, serving the state gives citizens purpose. Most European nations are yellow, so it's the opposite. If you pick B, come on. A society may tend to decay unless it is led by an authoritarian leader. That's a great quote. I love it. It's got nothing to do with the map, does it? Many people in Asia put their destiny in the unaccountable supreme will of others. Much of Asia is red or green. And that's your answer. And most people saw that. And number 20, the last one we're going to do, another one that the majority of people got right. Let's take a look at 20. Based upon the sentiment expressed in 2, Emma Goldman, an anarchist, would respond to the map from 1 by stating that to avoid social decay, weak-minded individuals should accept the supreme will of others. No, as an anarchist, you'd never say that. That's the opposite. The map is biased for as long as governments exist, there are truly no free people. She's an anarchist, so that's what she would say. Yep. She's not in favor of theocracy, otherwise she'd say D. She's not in favor of democracy, otherwise she'd see C. She's an anarchist, and because of that, she'd say that they're really, it says these countries are free, but they're not free because they're still under the oppression of government. And that's what an anarchist would want. And she's an anarchist because she says that state, religion, and capitalism provide a moral veneer covering up the exploitation. So we can infer this solution is to get rid of state, religion, and capitalism, which is, at a state political level, anarchy. All right, so that's the end of the first half, which seems to me took in excess of an hour. So if I'm taking an hour to go through 20 questions, and I made these questions, then if you're taking less than an hour to do 20 questions, you're doing the questions too quickly. I've made these questions. I know the answers. I'm still taking, 3 to 5 minutes per question, and so should you.